Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, president of Our Energy Policy, and welcome to our webinar for today. And we are very excited and very pleased to be able to bring you what will be a fascinating and enlightening discussion about issues affecting states all over the country. The conversation between John Rhodes, the until very recently chair of the New York State Public Service Commission, Kyle Kimball, vice president for government, regional, and community affairs for Con Edison. We'll touch, of course, on how New York has handled these issues, but it will address in large measure the issues regarding reliability, affordability, decarbonization, and all of the other key issues facing states all over the country. So we're very excited to bring you this conversation, which we're going to get to in just a second. First off, I would like to thank Con Edison for co-hosting this event with us, and thank all of our partners, the Grace Richardson Fund, Bracewell, Schiff Hardin, National Grid, API, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, US Grid, and our underwriter for the series, BP, for supporting our energy policy and being able to bring you these bi-weekly events. And finally, I just want to encourage all of you to submit your questions. At the last part of the conversation, we'll turn it over to you for questions. And if you look at the dashboard on your right, there's a questions tab. Just type in your question. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. And as always, on our website at Our Energy Policy, there are discussions that are going on now, which are directly relevant to the discussion that we're going to hear in a couple of minutes. And I would urge all of you to join that conversation, weigh in with your thoughts, insights, experiences as part of the dialogue continues online. So thank you again for joining us today. I'm now going to turn it over to Kyle Kimball. Kyle, the former president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation under both Mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio, now the Vice President, Government, Regional, and Community Affairs for Con Edison. And Kyle will introduce John Rhodes and we'll kick off the conversation. So thanks to all of you. Kyle, take it away.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks again for hosting this event. I have the pleasure today of getting to have a conversation with John Rhodes. For those of you who don't know John, he was appointed by Governor Cuomo in 2017. And just completed his 4-year term as chair of the Public Service Commission and CEO of the New York State Department of Public Service. Prior to his time as a regulator, he really brought over 30 years of experience in both the financial and energy sectors, notably as president of the New York State Energy Research and Development Association, where he really oversaw the development and execution of nation-leading strategies to combat and withstand climate change, to build a more cleaner and a more affordable energy system here in New York, as well as a $5 billion clean tech fund for clean tech development here in New York State. He also worked at NRDC in the private markets of innovation at Good Energies, really thinking about and leading global tech innovation and investment, and also served as a partner at Booz Allen. And over those years, his focus on energy and finance and a number of other sectors really has allowed him to make a huge imprint on the policy and the energy future here in New York, and arguably it's a model for the rest of the country. So I think we're going to have a good conversation today on what we can take and extrapolate to the larger conversation around the United States. In addition to his time here in New York State, and all those adventures professionally have led him to live in India, Germany, Brazil, Argentina, Albany, and now New York City. So with that, I'd like to welcome John, and thank you, John, for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for that introduction. It makes me sound like I'm done, which is not the implication I really like. There is more to do, and it does make my life sound very exotic, ending up in Albany the way I have. So thank you. And thank you, Bill. Thank you, Our Energy Policy, to the whole team and the partners, and of course to Kyle for allowing me to join you here today for a conversation about clean energy. I thought I'd start with my own perspective on the chapter that I just completed as a regulator, and before that as the head of NYSERDA, but use that really as the basis for talking and answering questions and the like, because I think the most value we can get is when we think about what to do with what we've got and where to go from where we are, because my basic premise is that there's a lot more to do after all. So let me flash back to 2013 when I joined the state energy team as a new fellow at NYSERDA. And I had colleagues that were also new in the role, Richard Kaufman, Kate Burson, and a whole set of other fantastic partners that I won't list. But what we found, or what we faced when we got there, was a clear need to act on the climate crisis. We just had been through Sandy, which was not good. And it was very clear that the energy system that we had and we're on a path to have was not the one that New York needs. And the one that New York needs is one that's clean, it's affordable, it's reliable, and it's just and equitable. And those four adjectives really are the core tenets to keep in mind, and that I think we've done a pretty decent job of keeping in mind. So we had to change the system, and we also had some opportunities for changing the dials. To us, it was very clear that there was innovation that was on the sidelines that could be brought onto the system. It was clear that there was investment and resulting deployment that could be unlocked to bring the resources that we need onto the system. And we also knew that we had to make the economics better. That the costs that we faced in 2013 couldn't be the cost, that just can't be the answer kind of thing as we look forward to 2020 and 2030 and 2050. And always, we resolved to think big in the sense of don't shy away from the changes just because they're daunting, but also be practical. This is not just a big idea job, it's a make things work job, and to get things deployed and have our initiatives be a success for everybody who's affected. And we knew that government had a really important role to play in this, particularly the states, and not just the states. In 2013, we had a friendly federal administration, and with the right team, the feds can do a lot to help with funding and finance and setting standards and spurring innovation. But even in those circumstances, and I think still as we enter into the much friendlier environment of a Biden administration, the states are really in the thick of it. And what are the states' roles? Well, one is the state can actually invest public funds to spur the deployment of the resources that we need and the innovation that the future needs, while making sure that businesses do what businesses are good at and creating opportunities to be excited about that and motivated that, but making sure that they're driving solutions that are good for the needs of New Yorkers. And sometimes the needs of the customer are not always identical with the needs of the provider, and we're going to pick the customer's needs when we go. The second thing is the government has a very important equity role. We know that as much as we want to take advantage of the power of private enterprise and competition, there are places where businesses won't go successfully. So providing opportunities for communities that have been left out of the clean energy transition was really important. Providing jobs for those communities as we get into the clean energy transition was really important. And making sure that above all, our whole energy system, including the energy transition, stayed affordable for the most vulnerable New Yorkers. Those were critical, and we could not leave them to the private sector. We had to be fairly involved as government in that. The third thing, of course, is there's just inherently a customer protective role the government has when it comes to the fact that not all businesses always fly straight, and some of them take advantage of customers. They seem to be inclined to take advantage of vulnerable customers, and also to handle events that put public health and safety at risk. So that was the role of government. But we didn't want to do it just as government. We also wanted to have as open a process as was feasible. Open, one, to make sure that we were being legitimate in what we do. Backroom ideas, strategies, as perfect as they may sometimes be, don't always attract the kind of confidence that you need to make and buy-in that you need to make real change. And the second reason to be open and transparent and engaged with others is the ideas of others can sometimes be very, very good, and wouldn't it be great if we could take advantage of those? How do we do? Well, I think we did okay. I think the design, the approach that we took is working. We are getting renewables onto the system. We are definitely well on our path to the 70 by 30 goal that the state has. We have costs across PV, large-scale renewables, storage, electric vehicles that are coming down, and the functionality is going up. Not to say that we drove that, but to say we knew it was going to happen, and we planned to take advantage of that. We've had specific successes like New York Sun and its declining megawatt block program. We have the Green Bank that was capitalized with $1 billion and is putting close to $300 million a year out to work in the market. We've got large-scale renewable costs that are coming down. We've got non-wire alternatives, which is a very neat policy wonky idea about non-traditional approaches to infrastructure, which are just a better idea when they're possible. We've got reliability where it needs to be. We've got jobs that are booming. We're making great progress. We're not done yet, but we're probably nation leading when it comes to the equity issues. And we were driving on these equity issues even before COVID and even before the EJ politics of the moment became so salient, because we knew that was what it was going to come and what was going to be needed. And plan beats no plan. Why don't we be prepared for that? And in general, innovation has shown up, sometimes in ways that we expected. I'll just say that we thought that progression in the photovoltaic market is exactly the one that's taken place. And in other cases, innovation has shown up and really taken us aback in a very positive way by the pace and power of the progress. And here I'm thinking of storage and offshore wind, where so much more is possible now than we were imagining back in 2013 and 2014 would be possible by now. And while we have challenges, the challenges are mostly the fruits of our success, because we're doing so well on getting large-scale renewables procured. Now we have a set of execution challenges around siting and transmission. Not to minimize them, but we're dealing with them and have a pretty good new approach in the state. But it's a good sign that we're now at the next wave of challenges, having dealt with the first one. And we know that we're going to need more solutions to come online, technology solutions and the like. And we think we've got a healthy, attractive marketplace for them. We don't know which solutions will show up, but the past 7 years have shown that some very good ones do. Some perspectives that I've had, I guess one, just to make it concrete, maybe start with a general thing and then go concrete. What are our mantras? What are the ones that we've found that work? And I'm not trying to say we got it right from the get-go, but we found our way into these principles. One, focus on ensuring that the money, the public dollars that we're trusted with, is spent well and usefully and most needfully. And sometimes this requires playing defense as much as offense. I can report to you as an empirical matter that people will come to government and ask for money to be spent on things that make sense to them, but to very few others. Bring in the stakeholders and bring in the implementers. That's absolutely, it's an absolute precondition for any successful rollout of any plan. Don't play your cards close to your vest. Give the world information about where you're headed, about where the opportunities are. Literally give them maps in some places, like, here's where we think there are non-wires alternatives opportunities. World, go there and see what we can come up. And generally the mantra of plan beats no plan. And I think that those perspectives, those principles really underpin what I consider a great success story in New York around offshore wind. So when our team showed up in 2013, there's a lot of interest in New York in doing offshore wind in New York the way Massachusetts was doing it. And the ask was fund us. And we get that Cape Wind is iconic. So, okay, it's shiny. That's very interesting. It's incredibly costly, but nonetheless, we should do it in New York. And it's incredibly controversial, but nonetheless, we should do it in New York. When we politely, I think we were polite, declined to just hand over that kind of a money. Instead, what we did is we created an opportunity, a marketplace for the industry that had scale. Our first announcement was 2.4 gigawatts, which was a lot. We've since upped that because we can see what's possible to 9 gigawatts, which is more. So we provided scale, we provided stability of that scale. This will be around for a long time if industry you come to invest. And we made our processes as competitive in every aspect as we could conceivably make it, so that we get the benefits of competition. This wasn't just philosophical. We had to spend a full year, 2016, if I remember right, on our offshore wind master plan. And that involved delineating more than 20 studies that needed to be done, and done fast and done well, and done so that they could meet the needs of other agencies such as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, on shipping channels, on geotech, on migration paths for marine life. We had to figure out how to talk to the communities that were affected, fishing industry, recreational boating, communities that had a viewshed, a concern, and the like, a Coast Guard. We had to figure out how to get the jobs in place, partly because this was a golden opportunity to create jobs, and partly because, honestly, there wouldn't be enough welders if we did. The thing was, if we took all the welders on the East Coast, we would shut down Electric Boat in Connecticut. We can't do that. We need more welders. And creating the training that was associated with that. And we ended up with offshore wind, which is now, I think, procured just north of 3 gigawatts, or north of 3 gigawatts of wind, closer to 4. We've got port infrastructure going in, some of it up the Hudson. We've got jobs and jobs training, across the state. And that's the model that we want. And you'll notice there's a little bit of a theme in the offshore wind story to jobs and workforce development. And that is an important aspect. We know we need new employees to do the new work. and we need them in the tens and hundreds of thousands. For instance, our clean energy agenda, I think that is as outlined on energy efficiency and the like, is probably good for 100,000 new jobs. We also know that we have to provide access to those jobs, not just for the usual suspects, but we have to create pathways into those jobs for the communities that have been left out. And by the way, in our clean energy transition, we're actually talking about taking some jobs away. We have an important workforce that works on fossil plants in the state, very dedicated, professional, qualified people. And some of those facilities are going to go away. What do we do for those folks? Partly out of fairness, and that is important, but partly because these are incredibly rich skill sets that it would be a shame to not repurpose for the new skill sets we see. So, and that's in fact been this whole workforce development thing has been a very important aspect of what NYSERDA specifically has done in terms of creating $100 million funding of job and job training, of creating an offshore wind center of excellence with a training arm out there on Long Island in order to make it work. So that's pretty much the perspective that I've had. I'm aware that New York is unique in many respects, but I actually believe it's also not unique. Of course, we've got the resource mix that we have. We have Niagara Falls, not many other states have that. We have a NYSERDA, not many other states have that. But our agenda, the four cardinal points of clean, affordable, reliable, and just have to be true everywhere. Maybe different states weight them differently, but they're the same everywhere. The physics and the engineering and the underlying economics of the resources are the same. I'm afraid that the reality of climate change is the same, even if some states choose not to acknowledge it. Another reality is that change is coming, even if only given the rate at which technology is advancing. PV is coming. Storage is coming. EVs are coming. And just the whole complex of IT, sensors, and control algorithms, and the like are coming. You can't have cost and functionality improvements of more than 10% a year, which is the case in each of these resources, and not change the reality on the ground. Given that, I think all states and the federal government and the Dutch government, all governmental entities, really have a set of challenges that honestly is more alike than unique. And I'll just go back to some of the themes that I started with. What I've learned, I think, is the government does better when it protects and when it plans and when it spends smart and usefully and for the right results, and when it harnesses others, NGOs, community organizations, private sector, to do what they do well, those other entities. And corollary, doesn't count on them to do what they won't do well. That's my setup. I apologize if it was a little fast or it was a little philosophical, but I feel like we've been practical regulators here in New York, and that's where we are.
That's great. So building off of something that you just said, what strikes me, being a part of this conversation and you having the experience of being in the room making decisions, is a lot of these decisions are very complicated, very complex, very big picture decisions around how an energy grid itself is going to work and how it's going to work reliably, and very courageous decisions I think, and forward-looking decisions in terms of how it should work. I guess the question, and that's really a collaboration between private and public interest and balancing both policy priorities, private priorities, the voices of stakeholders. I guess my question to you is, in your experiences, what are public companies, when I say public, what are private companies doing? What are they getting it right? And I'll ask the same question around sort of the public stakeholders in terms of if you can point to one thing in your experience that the private entities are getting right. And then I'll ask the same question.
Go ahead.
And then I'll just turn it around and ask the same question on what can private companies and public entities be doing better?
So thank you. So obviously it's a little bit of a general question, so the answer will be also general. But I think it's fairly clear that companies, the private sector, under the pressure of competition, does innovation, and it does it well. And it does cost reduction well. And both of those are absolutely essential to the path that the nation and the planet needs. And they also do what I call go-to-market pretty well. Here's an idea, there's a customer. How do we get the idea to be something that the customer wants in their business or in their home and is willing to pay for and make some investment in order to achieve? I think the public sector, its role is to kind of step in sensibly where the market doesn't go and can't go well. So I don't think the market is well set up to handle the thinking required for climate change when carbon, is not part of their calculus. They know how to think about, the cost of a machine. They know how to think of a cost of an office building, and they know how to make that work in their decision making. But government has to say, well, here's how we want you to reflect carbon. For instance, with our procurement, the way we buy, the way we support large-scale renewables. We internalize the externality. And you've heard me talk also about the equity issues. And then finally around offshore wind, I'll also make the point that sometimes government is in a better perspective to take the long view than the private sector. In every new technology, the first installment is going to be costlier than the one down the road. And sometimes, the government is the only one that can sort of say, well, I'll look at the whole portfolio and I'll go get a bundle of solutions across our portfolio. And I'm okay if the first project is costly, as long as the whole collective set of projects is not so costly. Where I think the blind spots are, or where the gaps are, I think it's not one that any sector is getting wrong. It's more that, who's seeing the whole solution, right? Who's making sure that systemically we're getting what we need? And so, I think that's where kind of the movement, if you will, is required from the public sector and the private sector, and also from, let's call it the advocacy sector, because everybody can have a pretty clear view of what they want, but you're really only looking at, individual aspects of the elephant, right? To use that old proverb. And sort of, and it's not a natural act for any one of these entities to do that. So the other point I would make is a lot of the decision making and debate and negotiation that I've been exposed to in government is really about the what. We want a clean energy fund, and a little bit silent about the how. But my observation is if things are really going to change on the ground, the how is at least as important as the what.
Right.
And so that's another bit of a gap to be filled.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about your mantras, and one of the things you said is that you focus on sort of clean, affordable, reliable, and fair as a key framework for almost every decision. So I'm going to focus just a second on the clean and reliable. What would have been like for you when in your position at the PSC when everything was going down in Texas during the winter storm? What would that have been like? That experience have been like for you in New York State?
Well, I mean, that's sort of a bit of an unfair question because, but I don't mind, as you'll see when I go forward, because I think the Texas event highlighted pretty much every single choice that Texas made that is different from New York's choice. And I think to me, and I think to many observers, it shows that we kind of got a lot of things right. I believe, and I say this knowing that only the most preliminary understanding is available today of what happened. I mean, there's actually a lot of information. The ERCOT has been very good, I think within 24 hours of kind of providing data on which units went down and the like. But what are some of the differences? One, they really left it to the markets. What that meant in effect is they chose to go without an insurance policy. In New York and in most other states, there's explicit thought given to how much just-in-case reserve capacity do we want? What's the number? And how do we pay to make it sure that it's ready when we need it? They didn't do that. And they had their own well-thought-out reasons to do that. But there are people out there who go without insurance. They choose to. I think that's okay when it's a private decision. When it's a public decision that affects the health and safety of the public, New York didn't make that decision. They didn't have the plans that they needed at the macro level and at the operational level. I think that there's some evidence that their assessment of load and available supply was not refreshed annually the way New York does it. And so that they had some, things that were in place that were probably not the right set of stuff. And they had operational information that was missing. One of the things that happened to them was the gas pipeline broke down. The compressors froze up, as can happen in severe weather. They needed power to get those compressors back. They did not know what feeders the compressors were on. As you know, and we have that information. They lacked the interties to neighboring regions. They would have let Texans get power from the neighboring pools, not on day one, because MISO didn't, Southern Power didn't either, but on day 2 and day 3. And then they lacked the customer protections that exposed Texas households to energy bills that were running $7,000, I even heard of $17,000. If you were lucky enough to have power, you then got gouged. And so that whole system of insurance, of operational and system planning, and of customer protection is a set of decisions that we fundamentally made that were different. I'm no longer at the PSC, but I guarantee you that it will be a very important role for New York, along with the ISO and other entities, once there's actually a real after event understanding of what happened, to take lessons. And I guarantee you there will be lessons that we will be extremely glad to take on board here in New York. But on the points that I just went through, those failure points were not ones we were vulnerable to.
Yeah. So speaking of insurance, as it's clear, very clear that we have to transition away in large measure from carbon to address climate change, and relatively quickly. And that's clear from the policy, that's clear from the science. I think the question that remains sort of in the meta conversation around the movement towards electrification is, what is the role of gas in that? And so bringing up your idea of insurance. So I guess the question for you is what do you see as the role of gas in the transition to a less carbon energy grid, or carbon-free energy?
So that's a very fair question, and I think the honest answer is that there's a lot more that's unknown about the answer than is known about the answer. I think the following observations are fair, are reasonable. There are two main principles. There are two principal uses for gas for power and gas for heat. Our pathway to gas for power, backing down gas out of the power grid, is much clearer than it is for gas for heat. And I am extremely confident that we can get to the 70 by 30 goal, 70% renewables by 2030 in good shape. After that, it's always the case that the last whatever megawatts or megawatt hours are the hardest to get. We don't know quite how to do those. Maybe something like thermal generation needs to be part of that mix, but we don't know that yet. It's clear that flexibility needs to be a part of that mix, and flexibility can be dispatchable plants. It can be storage. It can be dynamic load. And all of those, particularly storage and dynamic load, have really great promise of just steady, rapid, strong improvement. Mm-hmm. On the heat side, I think that there's a solution gap. I think it's fairly clear how to electrify certain building typologies. It's far less clear how to electrify others. We need solutions. We need better economics. So there's a whole innovation agenda that's really important that has to happen. And then I just think that buildings in general are a tough sector for energy transition. Buildings are not primarily about how they use energy. They're primarily about the needs of the people that are in them, right? So, especially work environments or places to live and eat. And people think about buildings as energy machines appropriately, not that often. I guarantee you Con Ed thinks about the energy system pretty much 98% of the time, I think. I guarantee you that a PV solar developer does the same. So it's a little bit of a different sector.
So that's an interesting point. So being reminded, there's a lot of people on this webinar who come from very different service territories. You presided over, the entire state, which you have, people like me who are thinking about dense urban fabrics, but you also have, variable terrains and rural settings. And so it seems to me you sort of have to change the conversation also around the market that you're serving, right? And there's people here who are thinking they're operating in mostly suburban or rural contexts, right?
That's absolutely right. And I know this because when I talk to my fellow regulators, we do that from time to time. I can talk to the folks from Maine, and it sounds a lot like upstate. And I can talk to people from Maryland or from California, it sounds a lot like downstate. And so, and the challenges are different. But I think the four principles and the overriding principle of practicality still allows you to make progress.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think renewables are easier to cite upstate than downstate. I think transportation is easier to decarbonize downstate than upstate. I think costs are more straightforward and lower upstate than downstate. I think the ability to really get mileage out of storage and dynamic load is much richer downstate than upstate. So there's, you know, if you're guided by what's practical and what's affordable and what achieves the goals and what's fair to people, I think there's different work to be done, but progress to be made everywhere.
Yes, and I think it's also, you know, important, and I'm sure you think about this all the time, that you have to, you know, at the end of the day, people want their power to be on and their homes to be heated, or, you know, again, thinking about the consumer. And I'm sure it can be hard to get buy-in on the policy when the thing that people are buying into is very intangible, meaning combating climate change. You know, they can't see it necessarily. They can't, you know, experience combating climate change, but they can experience getting a bill, or it can experience an interruption in their service. And so it's really trading, when customers are doing the cost benefit, it seems, you know, trading the intangible and intangible experiences.
Well, so my own observation is that the awareness and appetite to invest to avoid climate change is a lot higher in 2021 than it was in 2013. So I think there's a basic willingness to go there. I think it helps that there is concrete progress that you can show. You know, people can see PV on roofs now, that and that to show that it's possible and practical. I think it's essential, and I know this can sound like, you know, goo-goo, good government, happy talk, but it's essential to be really honest about the fact that you're spending the money wisely and usefully. My own general sense is that the public is willing to let the government spend public dollars to transition the energy system if it's being spent usefully and for their benefit. And if it's not being spent that way, then the legitimacy of the whole adventure gets a lot weaker. And then the final point is that I think that this is another place where New York has done something really good. And I didn't do it, I inherited it. But Audrey Zibelman before me put in place, with some fantastic support by some stakeholders, an energy affordability program, which was basically a hold harmless cap on energy cost as percent of income for the most vulnerable New Yorkers, capped at 6% for utility bills. And with that in place, you know, you've kind of, if you've got the other things in place, like this thing is real, we have to do it. They're spending the money usefully, and we're not being regressive about it and doing this on the backs of the most vulnerable. We're keeping them where they need to be and protecting affordability for those who most need affordability. Then I think you've got a good, a good argument for support. And I find that that's actually playing out along those lines.
This has been great. I have so many more questions, but I think we have a lot of questions coming from our audience members as well. So I will be less selfish and turn some of the questions over to our hosts at Our Energy Policy. I don't know if Kevin, if you want to, or Bill want to read some some of the questions to us?
Thank you very much, Kyle, and thank you, John, for the presentation so far. This has been great. We do have a lot of questions lined up already, so we'll jump right in. First question is from John Chicatano. What solutions can states and utilities deploy to unlock capital for the large yet relatively untapped potential of residential energy efficiency? What are the biggest barriers to scaling up, especially where efficiency gains are greatest?
So I think that you're talking about buildings. It's already alluded to as being kind of a tough sector. I think John's question was about energy efficiency, but in my mind, the answer applies also to building electrification. But one of the biggest challenges is uptake. Getting the building decision maker, homeowner, say, to say yes to upgrades. The evidence is that it's difficult even when the economics are good. It's just some people don't want to go through the disruption that sometimes these solutions entail. So, and that's just an inherent challenge, one that we've got to get better at meeting, but one that we just can't pretend isn't there. And it's quite different. Compare it to buying an electric vehicle or putting solar on your roof. Just the inherent propensity to say yes is really different by the customer. The second is, I'll just observe that there are solution gaps. We have things we need to do in buildings that we don't yet know how to do practically and affordably. Yes, we've got great lighting. Yes, we've got great smart thermostats, but how to do improvements to the building envelope, not so easy. How to electrify a New York multifamily building that's on the Con Ed, bless its heart, steam system, not so easy. And then finally, finance. When you have something that takes an upfront payment in return for benefits that happen over time, say the next 15 or 30 years, that needs to be financed. That's how the world works. But these kind of building solutions don't have access to infrastructure levels of finance. And what we're talking about in buildings is fundamentally infrastructure. It happens to come house by house by house. It's not one big $2 billion bridge, but it is infrastructure. Until we can find a way to flow finance as a cost-reducing measure to buildings as an infrastructure, as if it were infrastructure, I think we're going to have an uphill battle. John asked, what are the answers? I don't know what the answers are, but I think that those are the avenues on which we have to make progress: uptake, solution gaps, and finance.
And the only thing I think that's a great answer. The only thing I would add is also, I think, our ability to send appropriate and timely price signals, moving away from volumetric pricing, will, I think, certainly help speed along the interest in some of the efficiency solutions.
Yeah, some of my worst hours were spent on rate design, but thank you, Kyle, for bringing me back to that.
Well, thank you very much for the answers. Next question here is from Nicole DePaulo. Some states have passed a percent income payment plan to ensure that low-income ratepayers, already overburdened with economic hardship and health issues due to climate change, don't take on an additional burden. Could this work in New York, or could this work in other states as well?
So, Nicole, I think we have that, as I mentioned, and I believe we were earlier than most in doing that. It can work, and it is working in New York. It's not perfect. You know, there's a lot of devil in the details, and it's you know, it's just it's a constant work in process to get it right. But absolutely, I believe that even if we're not doing as well as I hope we're doing and think we're doing, I think that is the right path. And by the way, I do think we're doing quite well. But yeah, having that kind of income calculated cap on energy burden, to me, is essential to making this energy transition work while still preserving fairness and equity. I mean, the three issues of justice when it comes to this are: people need to have affordability in their bills, particularly the most vulnerable New Yorkers. People need access to clean solutions, particularly the most vulnerable New Yorkers, and needed access to the economic prize that comes with the jobs transition, particularly the most vulnerable New Yorkers. And so the affordability concept is one of the pillars.
Great. Well, thank you for that. You mentioned jobs, so I'd like to jump to this question here from Mike Lubell. Regarding new jobs, how many of them are short duration construction jobs and how many of them are related to long-term operations? How many require workers to relocate temporarily and how many to relocate permanently?
So by and large, the jobs that are happening, so the biggest driver of jobs in this clean energy transition really are the building related jobs. Right now it's energy efficiency, and by the time you get into building electrification, it'll be even more true. I believe the New York number is around 75% of clean energy jobs are in the building sector. I consider those steady jobs. I consider them, and some of them literally are operations and maintenance jobs. But if you are someone who is going in and doing energy efficiency measures, and yes, this installation is a 4-week project, but the company has a backlog for the next 2 years, and that's what you're going to be doing, installing these measures. You know, that to me is a permanent job, not a construction job. I think in many cases the construction jobs are important, and they are time limited, but they're not the majority. And in terms of relocation, I believe that I don't think it's a burden to ask people to relocate for a construction job. I believe that the permanent jobs are actually where people already are. That's kind of where the workforce is. That's where the buildings are. And I think the hardest relocation challenge relates to the important workers at existing facilities who may be shutting down as a result of the energy transition. And sometimes, one of their options is to relocate. That's a very difficult decision. I think the only thing that the state can do, and I think it must do this, is to create, the best alternative opportunities locally, short of relocation, so that there's, access to the jobs, there's access to the reskilling for those new jobs that is available locally. That's a tough issue, but an important one.
John, do you think on that issue of jobs that so one of the issues we faced in transitioning New York City's economy to a tech economy was a skills gap in terms of people's readiness for coding jobs, and so there's a lot of investment put into the education system to get people ready for those jobs, both public and private partnerships. Do you think that there needs to be a better partnership between the energy industry and the educational institutions and getting people the right skills for those?
Yes, but not just. I think that there needs to be a better, and it's happening, but continued improvement in the partnership with the companies that will ultimately be the employers, right? I'm the energy efficiency company that's going to need the electricians. And so I'm investing the time and everything else that it takes to be clear about my needs and kind of ensure that the journey for Linda, currently the 11th grader, is as smooth as possible, from where she is to ultimately a job. And I'll just, give a shout out to organized labor. I think that some of the best training, school to work, et cetera, programs are happening with the labor unions. And I'm going to take a risk and, possibly leave some out. But I think what IBEW and 32BJ are doing is fantastic. So partnership, absolutely. Yes, with the educational institutions, but not just.
Got it. Makes sense.
Thank you very much. Next question here, we might have time for one or two more, is from Jacob Warrenklein. You talked about internalizing externalities. What structure would you suggest for a system of carbon pricing for the energy sector and the broader US economy? And do you have an initial cost of carbon in mind?
I do have an initial cost of carbon in mind. I know that under our New York State energy large-scale procurement model, we are buying carbon, I believe, for under $15 a ton, abating carbon for under $15 a ton. I think that's a great price to pay. I think we should pay. The lowest price we can to reduce carbon. And in the power sector, I think there actually is an incredibly strong argument for going with what the economists called a marginal cost of abatement model, which is what does it take you to get rid of the carbon? In other sectors, it may be correct to use other models like a damage assessment. That if we just let the carbon go, it's going to impose costs of $50 or $75 or $125 a ton on the economy. But in the power sector, we have a special opportunity because we've landed on such an effective way by supporting renewable energy, whose economics are getting better every year, of doing it cheaper. And the only other point I'll make is when we do carbon support in the power sector, we have to be aware that power is an input into the building sector and the transportation sector, and it would be counterproductive, that's a gentle word, if we did high cost carbon pricing in the power sector so as to raise electricity prices enough so as to reduce the pace of electrification in vehicles and in buildings. I think there's a way to get it right, but I don't think a blanket high carbon price, let's start in the power sector approach is actually the right one. I have a point of view.
Well, thank you for that. Next question here, we had a few come in regarding this issue, so I wanted to bring it up. This is from Gary Krellenstein. With the closure of Indian Point Nuclear Facility, natural gas is going to play a larger role in the power production in New York State and City over the next few years to meet both reliability and additional power needs. How does New York intend to transition from this increased dependence on cheap natural gas, and do you think the potential HVDC line to import Canadian hydro to New York City should be pursued?
So I think that the Indian Point replacement plan started maybe in 2011 or so, I believe, when it became clear that there was possibly a need for safety reasons, among others, but very importantly, to consider a different future for that facility. Downstate in the zone served by Indian Point, we started implementing energy efficiency and demand response and other solutions, which simply, objectively speaking, are not gas. They just are not. The second thing is we started building transmission plans, or planning for transmission lines, Western New York, AC, that bring upstate power, which is increasingly renewable and carbon-free downstate into the Indian Point zones. It is true that in the short term or medium term, whatever your phrasing is, there are new gas plants and/or gas plants that will see increased hours of operation in order to pick up some of the remaining slack. But that will come down as the renewable resources in the region come online. I happen to believe that at some point, God wants Canadian Hydro to come to New York City. It's a clean resource. There's a need for it. I don't know if this HVDC line is the right answer or not. I do know that NYSERDA is running a competition, and you know already that I love competitions. So we'll see. And I'll also just point out that one of the beauties of offshore wind, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't cite it before, is that it is located offshore New York City. And when we energize in 26 or 27, that will be a huge solution. I'll stop.
John, I hate to interrupt because this conversation is fascinating, but as I believe you invoked divine intervention on Canadian Hydro, this might be the right time to jump in. I want to thank both you and Kyle for that illuminating, really fascinating discussion about so many of these critical issues. Thank our entire audience for taking the time to join us today. I also want to encourage everyone to go to the Our Energy Policy site and weigh in with your thoughts in the conversations online that are there, and also take advantage of our resource library there. As you're working on these issues, we have available at no charge, really the most comprehensive energy-focused resource library of articles, reports, studies, papers, and so forth. And I'd encourage everyone to take advantage of that. Finally, thanks so much to Con Edison for co-hosting this event with us, to all of our partners. I wish good health to everyone, good rest of the week, and again to John and Kyle, thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
Thank you in return.
Thanks, John.
Everyone stay well.
All right, take